Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. Today I'm joined by Professor Dirk Moses. Welcome to the show, Dirk.
Good to be here.
So, Dirk, you're the Anne and Bernard Spitzer Professor of International Relations at the City College of New York and one of the most original and provocative scholars working on the issue of genocide, mass violence, and international law today. Something that I suppose you, in particular, would not have predicted would have become even more relevant in the last several years. So, Dirk, there's a phrase that has become almost the master key of international politics. And it seems to, or well, it seems to have the effect where it unlocks any door. The bombing of hospitals, the starvation of cities, the assassination of leaders, the mass imprisonment of political opponents, the hanging of political prisoners. The phrase is legitimate security concerns, and we see this from literally every state on whatever end of, the kind of, I guess, like alliances, both West and non-Western as well. States have the rights to defend themselves. Legitimate security concerns are protecting its national interests. Once a state invokes security, everything that follows becomes permissible despite international law, and so on. It seems to be the magic formula that, states, even when they fundamentally disagree ideologically, sometimes politically, is something that they have agreed on. You've spent your career tracing how this logic works across 5 centuries. You call it permanent security, the aspiration to achieve absolute permanent immunity from all threats, not just eliminating current dangers, but erasing any future threat through wholesale destruction of civilian life if necessary. When every state has legitimate security concerns, who is ever safe?
Okay, that's a great question and opens a can of worms, Elif. It's very good to be with you here on your terrific program for the opportunity to talk through these things. So, I mean, you're referring when you mention this 500-year span to this book I wrote over a number of years, like 14 years, but it was published in 2021, so just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, and then the genocidal reprisal that Israel's engaged on Gaza after Hamas's attack in late 2023. So, in both cases, the Ukraine case and the Gaza case, advocates on all sides have actually talked about genocide. The pro-Russian groups and the Russian state talked about its invasion and invasion starting in 2014 as humanitarian interventions, protect Russian-speaking Ukrainians from genocidal assimilation. That argument was knocked down by the International Court of Justice in a case a few years ago. But what's evident is that all parties invoke genocide as and the genocidal aggression on the other side. That's what Israelis say about Hamas, for example, uh, to justify their case. Likewise, of course, Ukrainians and Palestinians say that they're victims of genocide. So this is sort of floating in the air, and as a political rhetoric as well as a legal claim, which would then get tested in the courts. Now, how is all that related to security and the state? Well, states exist in international law, and until relatively recent in human history, so over the last 100 years or so, since the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is a treaty between France and Britain, sorry, France and the US, and then others joined it, about uh, rendering warfare, aggressive warfare legal. Uh, until then, and then of course until the UN Charter, which forbade intervening in other states, in other words, invading other states. States could invade and conquer and annex legally. I mean, it was sort of an anarchic international system. Okay? It's sort of in this. So it's only been over the last 100 years where moves have been made to stop that in order to stabilize borders, because people understood warfare is the father of all terrible things: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, obviously, you know, ethnic cleansing, massive population displacements. So if you maintain international peace and stability and security, which was that's the language of the UN Charter, then you reduce human suffering. Okay. Now, even then, though, and this is also in the UN Charter, retain the right of self-defense. Now, that's even being invoked now by the US and Israel to attack Iran. They're doing this sort of, they say, in self-defense on the argument that Iran and those two countries have been engaged in sort of an ongoing conflict for decades. That's the pretext. No one takes this seriously in international law, but they are trying to advance this attack in terms of self-defense that all states claim as a sort of primal right. So, if their existence is imperiled, then they can do whatever they like. But it's interesting that they still want to maintain the legitimacy of international law by arguing in terms of the UN Charter of self-defense, although no one takes it seriously. The issue of security is, you're absolutely right, hegemonic and normative. Like, no one argues that states aren't allowed to secure the welfare of their population. I mean, that's why, if they're a democracy, that's why they're elected, to maintain security for their population, internally and externally. Okay. But as you say, that has been a pretext to allow all kinds of sins and excesses. In the name of legitimate security interests, states engage in all kinds of criminality against their own population and against others. We see this in illegal occupations of other people, which includes Morocco and Western Sahara, for example. There's more than one going on in world politics, but the one we know best is the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. We'll get back to that, obviously, because I know your listeners are interested, and the issue of security is elemental there. Now, what I've tried to do with this notion of permanent security is to disaggregate different modalities of security in order to differentiate between legitimate, actually legal and legitimate deployments of security that a state can engage in. For example, a state is entrusted by its population to engage in energy or to secure energy and, say, food security, right? There's nothing, in a sense, wrong with that, right? Make sure that its populations can be fed. This is now a challenge for many countries in East Asia and even Australia because of the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, where much of their fertilizer and oil comes from. That doesn't apply to the US, which is much more self-sufficient. But those countries are going to run out of oil, gas, and fertilizer pretty quickly. And so, the issue of food and energy security is sort of on the table. Now, we can argue then that there's a sort of mode of legitimate security discourse. But the states and all states, China, Turkey, Israel, US, many others of all types will use that as a cover to engage in excessive security measures. And that's where the notion of permanent security comes in. Permanent security may sound like an anodyne or positive ideal, but I'm arguing it's a deeply sinister one that states engage in, as you say, when they want to not just confront an immediate threat, which any state is allowed to, and Israel was too, legally in relation to Hamas. We'll get to the details of that next. Okay? It becomes an excessive and, if you like, illegal mode of security when it aims to prevent security threats in the future, when it becomes an anticipatory logic, when it's preventative and preemptive. And I mean it in this way. And I'll give you a concrete example. So in the case of the Rohingya sort of genocidal ethnic cleansing in 2017, there was a little uprising in the south of Rakhine State by a separatist Rohingya group. Now, the state could have responded by confronting that immediate threat, which is a few hundred people, some militia and so forth, right? But they didn't. They went much further and they decided, we want to prevent any kind of secession or separatist movement in the future. And we'll do so by removing the entire Rohingya population from the sensitive border region, Rakhine State, by driving them violently, mainly into Bangladesh, 750,000 people, And now there's a case before the ICJ that this was a genocidal act. So that never again in the future can there be a secessionist movement. So in a sense, we're pulling out the problem of separatism by its roots, once and for all manner. Now, doing so means you're attacking not only or confronting not only the militants, if you want to use that language, the entire population in whose name they purport to act. So you are attacking innocent women and children, men, and uprooting entire communities that have been there for generations. This is clearly criminal in some way. Now, whether it's genocide, ethnic cleansing, or what have you, crimes against humanity, that is something for the lawyers to determine. But it's clearly a state excess of some kind. And what the notion of permanent security allows us to do is not engage in this sort of mechanical categorization that international lawyers do, but understand why it's happening, which the law isn't really interested in so much. Now, if we look at an analogous case, is the Uyghur people, that Turkic Muslim people in Xinjiang province in China, which is on the western part of China. There was also an uprising, a tiny uprising, killed several hundred Han Chinese in 2011. The Chinese state swooped upon that and said this was our 9/11. We want to combat terrorism just like the Americans were doing in their global war on terror. So they very much adopted the Western rhetoric as a cover. And rather than just confront, once again, the individual militants, who numbered, were numbering quite few, they decided never again will we allow this kind of uprising in a sensitive border area where there are many minerals. So we're going to incarcerate this population rather than expel. They couldn't do that for various reasons. We're going to incarcerate this population in a carceral prison complex, re-educate them, quote unquote, by de-Islamizing them. The men cut off their beards, women will be sterilized, etc. So at the end of it, we have a tamed Uyghur population that will not be inclined to participate in, or from whose number won't come any more militants who will try to secede and create a separate state called West Turkestan. So once again, they did so by attacking innocent people, and Uyghur advocates call it genocide. The major human rights NGOs like Amnesty and so forth talked about crimes against humanity.
Mm. I mean, there's so much to follow up in what you've said, particularly when it comes to like this security element of internal, external, security threats, and particularly some of the, security approach of, states like Turkey. We'll get to that in a second, and what's particularly the last few years have meant for the not just the legitimacy, but the mere existence of some of the international institutions that you referred to as well. You also, in what you just said, but also in your book, argue that the concept of genocide, as it currently functions in international law and in public consciousness, doesn't just fail to prevent mass violence, it actually actively obscures it. Because the debate often becomes, and you just spoke a bit about it as well, is it really genocide? As if the answer to that question determines whether the killing, matters, like as in whether anyone
Yes.
should care or not. Has the
Yeah.
word genocide or the kind of like the concept in, in the international consciousness become a way of hiding mass violence rather than preventing it? In other words, what happened to never again?
Mm. That's a great question. Once again, a can of worms, which will lead to a complex answer, an elaborate answer by me. But there's a lot going on and a lot to unpack. So, when the international community, such that as it was, as we want to call it that, sat down. So these were state representatives in the United Nations in 1947 and 48 to thrash out a genocide convention. When they did so by, I think, illegitimately distinguishing between warfare and genocide. Although, when Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish jurist who invented the concept in a book in late 1944, used the word genocide as a synonym for what he called wars of extermination, which he traced back to antiquity in the Middle Ages and so forth, and that the Nazis had started again by attacking entire populations, and not separating between civilians and combatants, right? The So that, I think that was a brilliant intuition. Wars of extermination or wars of devastation, as Ehud Olmert called the Israeli campaign in Gaza. He called it a war of devastation because the attack wasn't on the entire civilian population and not just on Hamas. Okay? And that's the point. Entire peoples are seen as the object of state violence for for security reasons, though, and we'll get back to that too. Uh, but when the UN delegates came to turn Lemkin's ideas into a codified law, and his book is like hundreds of pages, and then they come up with a pithy definition over several lines. You have you have a grand simplification, but B, they distorted or adapted his idea in a way that didn't honor the notion that that genocide was a mode of warfare, not separate from warfare. And Lemkin participated in this regretfully because or regrettably rather, because he understood that his original notion wasn't going to make it through these committees, because states weren't going to have their hands tied by a United Nations convention, which could affect them. They wanted to keep the ability to wage, if you like, dirty warfare, because you had the decolonization process starting, and the British, the French, and the other major empires wanted to keep hold of their possessions. In fact, for the Dutch and for the French, they were getting them back after they'd lost them to the Germans and the Japanese, respectively, right? And they wanted the ability to put down rebellions by Indonesians or Algerians and so forth. The
Mm.
Cold War was starting, and the Soviets and the Americans and their allies wanted the ability to wage war in a dirty way, which of course they'd done through the aerial bombing campaigns, which had killed hundreds of thousands of Axis civilians, most notably in two atomic weapons, which had just been used and which clearly attacked civilians. So they didn't want a definition of genocide which could encompass that style of warfare, which the West had also waged.
Mm.
Okay. So they distinguish genocide very surgically from warfare. Now, the reason I'm going into this detail is because the notion of military necessity and military objects as legitimate uh, targets of state action, like you are allowed to target a military object, is of course at the center of the debate regarding Gaza and Ukraine. Like if a state says, or a military acting for a state says, that hospital is become a military target because militants are inside or hiding weapons, or there are tunnels underneath, or it's a booby trap, then they can destroy it. And that is the pretext that's used again and again, that a putatively civilian object, a school, a hospital, or what have you, has been rendered a military target and is therefore targetable, is the way that states hide behind international law to engage in what in a campaign against an entire population. Now, when you engage in a military campaign against an entire population, which pushes it in a sense into the sphere of genocide, right? Because you're not distinguishing between combatants and civilians. It's not just a matter of bombing people or shooting them, in sort of massacres. It's also destroying everything that sustains a population, which means hospitals, schools, and so forth, and places of worship. Because what knits a society together are these institutions, as well as bare physical life. And we've seen that occur, obviously, in the Gaza case. And everybody can't forget the images that drones have shown us of just a flattened landscape, which are far worse than anything I've seen in World War II. People have often said, well, the British flattened Dresden and that was a legitimate act of war. In retrospect, a lot of people are very dubious about whether that was a legitimate act of war and not, some kind of criminality, not genocide, perhaps. So that was one aspect of the answer. I mean, your other question was about how does genocide hide or enable violence? Well, there are a number of elements to that. One is this putative hierarchy in international law, or at least in the perceptions of it, because the Rome Statute of the ICC doesn't actually have a hierarchy. But in public opinion, there is a hierarchy with genocide at the top as the crime of crimes.
Mm.
And there's reasons for that, which we can get into, like why is it considered the crime of crimes? Well, it's because genocide is seen as derivative of the Holocaust. The Holocaust as being the sort of the great evil of modernity of all time, and genocide is, in a sense, the codification of that criminal intention that people saw in the Holocaust, which is to attack and indeed eliminate a group solely on the grounds of its identity, for who it is, not for anything it's done. And we'll get to that distinction of agency shortly, because in doing so, the genocide definition derived from the Holocaust depoliticizes violence in the sense that that the victims of violence are agentless. They're not engaged in political activity of any kind, like resisting an occupation. So that's the distinction between Anna Frank, a German schoolgirl hiding in a Dutch uh, attic in Amsterdam, who's clearly not a threat to anyone. Okay, I mean, in the minds of the Germans, Jews were potential threats uh, in their bizarre ideology. So that once again, this permanent security thinking, you've got to kill the children before they grow up and become communists or partisans or what have you. That's how they thought. Obviously, they understood a little girl is not an immediate threat, but their understanding about their threat perception was much broader, and that's what makes it criminal. Uh, that's the distinction between Anna Frank, who's an entirely innocent and agentless in this mode of thinking, compared to Hind Rajab, who obviously is also a little girl, a little younger than Anna Frank, but was caught up in a firefight in Gaza, in the course of a confrontation between uh, Hamas, other armed groups, and Israel, is in Israeli tanks in this case. Now, on the logic that we're stuck with in international law, she is considered an unfortunate victim of collateral damage in armed conflict. That's how these things are categorized.
Mm.
It may be a war crime if you could ever assemble the evidence. Now, I know people are trying to do that. They've identified who shot, who was in charge of that tank. Questions would need to be asked. Why did they need to fire 355 rounds into that car, let alone kill all the other people in the convoy, which we know is not just her. But the context is very different to the death of Anna Frank. And the way international law and our memory culture has functioned is that Anna Frank is an iconic victim, absolutely innocent. The criminologists call this exemplary victimhood, absolutely innocent. Whereas, although Hind Rajab is obviously individually as a little girl innocent, and the people in her entourage are, she, according to this line of thinking, which I'd applaud, is part of a collective that is in the Palestinians in Gaza that is engaged in a resistance engaged in resistance activities against an occupier, and therefore is engaged in political activity, and therefore, and this is the terrible implication, Lee, is not absolutely innocent. Somehow they deserved it, and this. Even if it's a tragic byproduct, people say, well, I mean, no one thinks it's good. I've never met an Israeli who said, well, it's good that she died, right? But they go, these things happen in war, and Hamas started it. That's the logic, and therefore she is, in a sense, her innocence is mitigated. Now that is a fact. The fact that we engage in this kind of reasoning and would compare Anna Frank favorably to, as absolutely innocent and unjustifiably killed, completely unjustifiably, whereas Hind Rajab's killing, and she's just one of tens of thousands of little Palestinians in Gaza, right? As their deaths being somehow explicable, at worst tragic, but shoulder shrugging part of modern international affairs. That is a foundational flaw of our international system, which I was trying to get at in that book. And the notion of permanent security is a way of undermining the security rationales of states who will go, well, we need to engage in hard and decisive military action against an implacable foe that's resolved to destroy us, and that will mean, they'll argue, that unfortunately quite a few civilians will need to die along the way. I mean, even Netanyahu, he does this with a smirk on his face, but he'll say, well, we find the unfortunate killing of Palestinian civilians deeply distressing, but that's just a tragic byproduct of war. And this allows states to say, well, because warfare is a tragic but necessary part of international relations, but it's not genocide, to say, well, it doesn't shock us. Because what genocide does affectively, and this is a language or the phrase you'll hear repeatedly, Elif, is that genocide shocks the conscience of mankind or humanity. It was mankind in less, gender conscious days. But you'll even hear that today, and you'll hear that phrase in the Security Council where people condemn this or that. That shocks the conscience. And I've found traces of that language over hundreds of years in Western, often Christian, because it was about shocking Christendom back in the day, hundreds of years ago. That turn of phrase recurs all the time. So the question is, what is considered shocking and what is not so shocking? And what the Genocide Convention did is it elevated genocide and the way it was understood as the crime of crimes, and that developed in the post-war period as Holocaust memory became, a substantial factor in Western memory regimes. It wasn't the case in the 50s, but it was by the 80s. Right, there was a development there, and so people fix their hopes of recognition to that, they're victims of genocide, rather than only crimes against humanity. Although the numbers of deaths can be the same. I mean, after all, for crimes against humanity, you need a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population. And if you look at the Rome Statute of the ICC, it lists different kinds of versions of crimes against humanity. One of them is extermination. I mean, what's the difference between that and genocide? The only difference is that genocide requires a targeted attack on an ethnic, racial, or religious group. Like there's an ethnic dimension or racialized dimension, whereas for crimes against humanity, it's a civilian population in general.
Mm, mm.
So it's much easier to prove in many ways because, yeah, but that was the idea. So, I mean, I think it's a distortion of our memory regime that, uh, for example, the African Union breathed an audible sigh of relief when a UN investigation of what was happening in Darfur in Sudan in 2005 came out and said they didn't find evidence of genocide, although Western powers were saying this is genocidal, because they were very critical of the Sudanese state. It's crimes against humanity, the crime against humanity of extermination. And they said, that's fine. We'll accept that. Nothing to see here. I mean, that's terrible that crimes against humanity are seen as less grave than genocide. But that's the currency of recognition in the global system, unfortunately, that victim groups have to contend with. They're almost forced to have to say we're victims of genocide in order to gain attention. But it's a trap because analogizing with the Holocaust is so difficult. And this is the trap for Palestinians, or the cage, if you like, the memory and recognition cage, is that, when they say, well, South Africa in its case, right, that they're victims of genocide, they're saying, according to the law, that they're being attacked solely because they're Palestinian. And the Israeli advocates will say, well, no, we're responding to an attack by Hamas, and this is a war, not a genocide. You have this war genocide dichotomy instead of understanding that genocide is a mode of warfare and that the Israeli campaign is an attack on the entire civilian population. And of course, you've had blood-curdling uh, uh, declarations by countless Israeli leaders, media personalities, and just the general public who are which are genocidal in nature. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how the ICJ judges, assess this rival claims when they come to it in a couple of years.
I mean, I suppose what I'm hearing is actually there's a fundamental flaw in the international system of particularly of the different actually even the differentiation between genocide, crimes against humanity, and war. And this was the kind of like initial fundamental flaw in that these things were separated in the way that they
Yes,
were, and they were separated so states can still carry out war without having to deal with any accusation of genocide or a
correct.
crime against humanity. This there's a live example of some of the tensions of this framework actually playing out right now in Turkey. The Kurdish peace process, or the process that may turn into a peace process, is framed in two completely different languages. The Turkish state speaks of the language of security. So the PKK is a threat. The threat must be neutralized, and peace means elimination of that threat. So it's fundamentally a question of security for Turkey. And they've kind of named it a terror-free Turkey. The broad Kurdish movements, frames it in more of a democratization process. So actually, the peace process is a process of democratizing Turkey, and therefore the ability for, for example, Kurds and other minorities and other sections of society in Turkey to be able to engage in democratic politics,
Mm.
which would, in some ways probably require the transformation of the state itself. So, moving away slightly from what we've discussed, but actually very much related, can a security narrative and a democracy narrative ever produce the same peace?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, you know much more about the domestic Turkish situation than I do. Although in my class on violence and colonialism last week, we did cover the Kurdish question. So we read various Öcalan texts, including his most recent one, where he calls for the end of the armed struggle. And then what that has meant for the Turkish state and how they've responded. My understanding is they pocketed that and said, okay, now that that threat's been neutralized or it's subsided, and now we don't really need to deal with the Kurds. We don't need to accept their democratization plea. So, you know, the tragic lesson that some of my students are gaining or drawing from this and other cases that we cover is that sometimes armed resistance and non-armed resistance or non-violent resistance fail, and that there are peoples who are occupied or minoritized who for whom either option is unsuccessful. If you're confronting a state which is obsessed with security and also has a particular vision uh, of a of a of an ethnic supremacy that they were unwilling to yield because they fear that sharing power or uh, relinquishing a narrative in which they're completely in control could lead to the unraveling of the state itself. I mean, that's the case with the responses to attempts to have a binational state in Palestine, for example, which there's power sharing and so forth. Those that argue for a demographic Jewish Israeli majority will say, yeah, but then we can't leave our security to other people. And we know we need to control the the coercive aspects of the state, dimensions of the state, because otherwise we'll be vulnerable to the kinds of suffering that we experienced in the past. So past suffering and precarity are often mobilized to prevent the kind of peace process that you're talking about. Now, of course, there was no Holocaust in Turkey, and I'm guessing that the Kemalist and Islamist version of it with the current state relates to the anti-imperial narrative of the Turkish state going back to the early 1920s, when the Treaty of Sèvres partitioned much of modern Turkey and was only overturned by military action led by Ataturk to turf out the Greeks, the French, and others, and to prevent a Kurdish state, which I think was foreseen in the Treaty of Sèvres, wasn't it? Was there? Remind me.
So
But
yes,
anyway,
it was foreseen
yeah,
in the treaty, and then the Treaty of Lausanne that came after it.
negated that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But there's a sense that the state is, this is what I'm getting to, that state elites are obsessed with the notion that outside powers want to dismember Turkey. And so we need sort of ultimate control of all population elements, especially ones that are potentially secessionist, like Kurds, because they have, Kurdistan extends across the region. We need to confront and tame that, and there's no question that we can share power with these people, lest they get the idea that they, would join forces with their brothers and sisters across the border. So security for newer states is, Turkey is a relatively new state on the world stage, 100 years or so. Is is elemental, and those services, and the notion deep state does come from Turkey. It's not an accident, right? Uh, is they have an inordinate amount of uh, impact on the way state policy is fought. I mean, the same goes for a country like Pakistan.
Mm. I mean, if we move on to talking about, what justice may look like for people's permanent, like certain peoples that, this notion of permanent security
Mm.
has attempted to destroy. And, this I think brings in what I want to bring in a little bit is also this element of, the kind of like non-state and non-state, permanent security approach, which an example is when the Yazidis experienced a genocide that has been recognized by the UN, the EU, and multiple governments. But over a decade later, up to 2,500 women and children are still missing. Um,
Um,
Shengal or Sinjar, as known by some, hasn't been rebuilt, and not a single state has been held accountable. I guess there could be a discussion around
yeah.
what that accountability may look like. So, your book argues that the language of transgression, like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, was designed after the Holocaust, as you've also spoken about, to prevent exactly this. But you're, but we've also spoken about how, how basically a lot of this has failed. You know, if the international system can't deliver justice for, Yazidis, Kurds, Palestinians, what can? What can?
Yeah, this is where the state system is inimical to those that didn't get states at these various fissures or transformations in the global system, which are after the both world wars in particular, when maps were redrawn as empires collapsed. So the Ottoman Empire collapsed, as you know. It was, there were various secessions before that in the Balkans, Greece already 100 years before, and then Serbia seeking independence. But there was a rash of these after the First World War as the empire declined, less of the Balkans, but in the Middle East. You got mandates for Iraq, Palestine, and so forth. These were new states, and uh, but that one was foreseen for the Kurds, but was prevented by military action on the part of Turkey. Palestine didn't didn't end up like the other Middle Eastern mandates, which ultimately getting self-determination for its majority population. Instead, it was partitioned. Well, the UN said it should be partitioned, and then there was a war between uh, Israel, nascent Israeli forces and Arab forces, and Palestinians are rendered refugees and stateless. So Assyrians will talk in these terms too, a much smaller group of people that they wanted statehood in 1919 at Versailles and didn't get it, and have been a stateless people ever since. And there's lots of resentment in those communities. Armenians, with whom I've been speaking briefly last week, because I spoke at an Armenian commemoration day for the genocide when I was in Denver, are clearly still thinking and feeling about the genocide 100 or so years later, because although they have a state of Armenia in a Soviet creation, it's not in the core historic homeland as they see it,
Mm.
which is in Turkey today, where the ancient, Mount Ararat is, and the ancient Armenian heritage, which is also being systematically obliterated in Azerbaijan. So, you know, ancient nations will think in terms of their historic borders, which can be thousands of years old, where the people was born. There's an ethnogenesis narrative there, and modern states don't map onto that. So even if they have a state, it can be considered a contingent rump state, whereas the aspiration is to occupy and control through a state, because that's the way modern system is functioning, the entire historic homeland at some point in the future. And this is what's driving uh, the Greater Israel Project, I mean, it's a mixture of messianic aspirations that are independent of the Palestinian, because it's something that is generated from within that tradition through historic memory, biblical borders, and so forth. But the mechanism for it is, in a sense, I Arab and Palestinian resistance, because the way that borders expand in the international system is through something that the famous German historian of Rome, Mommsen, called defensive imperialism. That is, you have a state or an empire, and then across its border is a threatening entity uh, that, or a perception of a threatening entity. So you move into that territory to confront that th putative threat. So there's already an expansion. But in doing so, you create more resistance because people obviously feel threatened by your expansion. And so you then have to move further to confront the next threat, right?
Mm.
So there's an expansionary logic built in to the notion of self-defense. And that way, states, especially those favored by the West, can say they're not engaging in aggression, although that's clearly what it is. They're actually engaging in defense, but then they talk about it in terms of security, like buffer zones and so forth. We hear in southern Lebanon, right? But in doing so, they're of course depopulating southern Lebanon. Over, perhaps 1 million people have been displaced into north of the Litani River, and we've all seen the footage of villages being obliterated. Now, this is being, in southern Lebanon, this is being done in the name of permanent security. So never again, this is this notion, never again can Hezbollah or other resistance fighters use those as launching pads for missiles or to hide missiles. And nor will there in the future be a population, but above all a Shia population, from which Hezbollah can recruit. So we're pushing them further north and further away from Israel so that it's more difficult for them, according to this reasoning, to launch missiles into northern Israel and to effectively depopulate it, which is what happened over the last couple of years. And that was considered, of course, intolerable. If you followed the Israeli media, it's like, we can't have this threat permanently above the border. And so rather than negotiate, and this is the difference between a security and a permanent security mode, negotiate with the people across the border, whoever they are. I mean, it's the Lebanese state and Hezbollah, obviously a very complex situation because it's not the same thing. And Hezbollah is its own government in many ways and is implacably opposed to Israel. But rather than get to the root causes of that, which is a Palestinian refugee problem,
Mm.
which Israel has never wanted to confront, and some of the border issues there. Rather than confront that, Israeli authorities have said, well, let's ensure that never again are our northern borders vulnerable. So we're going to effectively expand our border north. And and they've done so not only in the Golan Heights in the past in '67, but now taking out chunks of Syria as well.
Mm.
Uh, and now, as you know, the not only has Gaza been destroyed, but Israeli forces are occupying more than half of it, the fertile eastern half, and where the agriculture was, and are effectively going to annex it as well. So Israel is definitely expanding, and there are those within Israel who are, who are arguing we should go further. So there's sort of an impulse from inside, but the security pretext, which is sold to their Western backers, is the one rather than a biblical one. And uh, Western powers, Europeans as well, not just the US, have accepted this because they see a greater game, with Israel, with the Iranian proxies here, which they see Israel, as Merz put it, the German chancellor, is doing the dirty work for the West by destroying Iran and Iranian proxies, who are, a thorn in the side of Western powers. But it's all backfiring a bit at the moment, at least regarding trade with in the trade of Hormuz. Though, in Lebanon, it's leading to the destruction of parts of Lebanon.
Mm.
So the the logic of permanent security is destructive for other people. So that it's a hubristic dystopian aspiration because not only are you creating insecurity for others by trying to have absolute safety for yourself, you're creating future security threats because people aren't going to forget what happened
Mm.
and will try to get their land back.
Yeah. I mean, you know, look, there's so many areas that we can go down in discussing in more detail, which I'm sure we will certainly do another time. But as a final question, I wanted to ask, what I've heard from you today is, there's this almost instinct to in when people are advocating say for the Palestinians or for Kurds, in terms of what the actions of the Israeli state or the Turkish state, or when people are advocating, say, even against the Iranian Islamic regime in its atrocities, and so on. There's this instinct to kind of try and place these states as almost rogue states, as though they're acting outside of some established order. But actually, what you've described today, it seems that these states, from the buffer zones that they establish to these like defensive imperialisms to other forms of violence in so many different ways, they're actually they actually are acting quite squarely in an established international order, which particularly was seems to have been ratified almost 100 years ago in some of these UN charters and so on.
Mm.
So, it seems that the UN was meant to act in more of a way to try and maybe, to try and maybe be almost like control some of the extent, but actually
Yeah.
never really designed to fundamentally stop some of the things that we're seeing. So, what the question is, and what I think will be interesting for people to hear is, how do we talk about it then if it isn't, for those who want to develop a language around it, it seems that it isn't really useful to say, either Israel is a rogue state or, Turkey, the way the actions of the Turkish state is actually against Western interests, when actually there
Yeah.
is an order that their actions very much fit in. So, what is the language, or what is the framework
Yeah.
that can be used, or does that framework not exist yet?
So, I mean, I agree with your premise to some extent, but I think I'd like to sort of talk about it slightly differently. I mean, the international law in terms of annexation, aggression, and so forth is quite clear, and different U.S. administrations make a difference. I mean, it's hard to imagine Biden having engaged in the war against Iran more recently. But you can obviously imagine the Trump regime doing that, or Trump administration. So the international order, such as it is, I mean, it's a slogan we use, uh, functioned with exceptions and in a rubbery way because there was a consensus, because nothing of this can be enforced, right? It's got to do with great power consensus. They model it, uh, adhering to the norms of non-aggression and so forth. I mean, one of the outcomes of the war uh, against Iraq, uh, the second one, was of course that it ruptured this. So the order has been unraveling for a generation. It's not just one moment, okay? And of course, it was complicated because Western powers did not recognize the occupation of Palestinian territory as legal. There was always a lip service to the two-state solution and the future Palestinian sovereignty. And in fact, last year we saw many Western states, including Australia, recognizing a Palestinian state. So the Europe, not the Americans, but the European states are still sticking to the idea of global order, international law. They don't want to give it up yet. There's a big distinction between, the states like Russia, the great powers, the US above all, and China, and then middle range states, smaller states, which rely on international norms and restraint because they're not great powers and they require them to defend the integrity of their own borders, right? So what we are seeing now are claims that Israel and America are behaving in a rogue way. Stephen Walt, the political scientist, international relations scholar at Harvard, is talking about that in an article on the current issue of foreign affairs. So it's some Western states that have gone rogue. So what does that leave for the activists that you were talking about? What language can they use? Well, oddly, the little that they're left with is international law because it does place some restraints on the expansionism of states. And there's a mechanism for accountability with the ICJ and the ICC. I mean, unfortunately, that's weak because we saw what happened to Karim Khan and the ICC judges, including some ICJ judges, when they turned their indictments against Western powers, not against Russia. They were applauded for warrants for Putin and one of his officials, but when they issued warrants for Israeli leaders, uh, the former Foreign Secretary Cameron uh, had a terse phone call with Khan and ticked him off and said, this is not why you exist. You exist here as an American politician to prosecute African leaders, but not our people. Okay? I mean, uh, you didn't hear any Western European leaders talk like that, but who knows what they're saying behind the scenes. They're caught in a bind. I'm not giving a very straight answer or clear cut answer because there's not a clear cut area. The
Mm.
Western leaders are caught between and I don't mean the US, but Western Europe, Australia, Canada, these kind of places, are caught between, on the one hand, being allied with the US and they share security, military intelligence, so forth, and not wanting to annoy the current president. On the one hand, on the other, they are committed to this sort of rules-based order which was established after the Second World War. But that order relied on American hegemony to contain everything, although America often violated it, like in Vietnam and in uh, and in Iraq, but so did the Soviets in Afghanistan. And we all know about their support of the Assad regime, which committed countless crimes against its own people. I mean, and more is coming out every day. So, but still, there were exceptions, but everybody understood that, tried to make the exceptions uh, acceptable by not saying that the norms are illegitimate. But now you do have some leaders saying that international order is meaningless now, and that we're in an anarchic situation like in the 19th century without these restraints on state expansionism, and it's a free-for-all. So states can say, well, we want Greenland, or we want to rename entire oceans according to our way of things, or that it's okay for Israel to expand. And Turkey is now implicated, and this is seen as, once Iran is eliminated, now Turkey's going to be the threat that the Israelis need to keep the peace internally, because that country will explode in its own sort of low-level civil war without the external threat. People forget that, on the eve of the Hamas's attack on the 7th of October, Israel was melting down in demonstrations about constitutional reforms.
Mm.
It's quickly forgotten, but it needs an external threat, and now it's going to be Turkey, and I'm sure you've been following that. But there's rivalries between those two states and Syria, as you know, and the Kurdish question is part of that. So, what can activists do these days, given the predatory nature of many states and the crackdown of, including Western states, and in the way that they're cracking down on civil liberties on their own population, including in Australia, very much the case in the UK and in Germany, which I study more carefully. It's the courts, ironically, which have often been seen as an instrument of the state, are, are protecting, to some extent, the rights of protest and free speech of the activists that you mentioned, Elif. It's an ironic situation. However, it makes sense that if you're in a highly authoritarian context, that all you've got left is the law. Now, sometimes this is seen by activists that I know as a counsel of despair. Like, Dirk, is that all you've got to say? I say, well, if you think that the state is authoritarian, and indeed you think some of you think it's fascist, do you think you can confront the state? you're just activists. They have the cops, social media companies, deep data that can like read everything you're texting to your friends. They have an army. What are you going to do? Like, so you can't confront it head on. All you can do is uh, plead for decency among the population, and elect politicians who will do the right thing. And for that, you need to appeal to a democratic majority.
Mm.
And
Thank
the Democratic majority wants the law. The opinion polls show us they respect international law.
mm. Thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts, Dirk. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.